All right, so my talk today is called this, Pitcairn Islanders, the British Empire, and the Island as Natural Laboratory. But I could easily have called it that, which is the working title of my book. And today I just want to run across some of the one of the biggest arguments that the book tries to make. And it's the argument that's encoded in the subtitle, which right now is how Britain's smallest Pacific colonies became natural laboratories for race, hybridity, and empire. What I'm interested in is how two small Pacific islands, Pitcairn Island and Norfolk Island, are used over time by anthropologists, linguists, archaeologists, historians, geneticists, lots of different kinds of knowledge makers, in order to make claims about human nature. But today I want to look especially at a kind of core notion that underrides a lot of that work, the idea that these places can serve as natural experiments or natural laboratories. And I want to unpack the history of this analogy and to show the very long history by which places like Pitcairn Island and the way that islands become construed as natural laboratories. So I want to begin by just addressing this trope a little bit. It's a long-standing trope. You might be really familiar with it from the history of biology. You might have heard of the Galapagos as Darwin's natural laboratory. But this is an idea that also pops up quite a bit in social science and the history of the human sciences. And it's an idea that's especially common in the Pacific. There's a wide and long-running trope whereby Polynesian islands especially, very small Pacific islands, are thought to be kind of model systems that we can use to examine in a very small way, very big things that happen in human history. So historians of science have unpacked this trope a little bit in the last 2 decades. They've looked at the reasons why and the ways historically that scientists have come to regard field spaces as natural laboratories or natural experiments. In a lot of this work, historians of science have looked at the ways that scientists use this trope rhetorically in order to give themselves a bit more prestige and to make their claims seem a little bit more credible. So in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, the really prestigious sciences were chemistry, physics. These were laboratory sciences. And laboratories were spaces where knowledge might be made credible because you can cut out external things in the outside world and really focus in on certain variables or isolate a phenomenon. And field biologists and ecologists would construe field sites as natural laboratories so that they could claim to be doing the same thing. They could claim to be producing the same kind of credible science, that nature in these places had cut away some external factors and left just certain variables. There's also a wide-running conversation in the history of science about the ways that we should think about field against laboratory. And a lot of this comes out of the work of the French science scholar Bruno Latour. So in a lot of this conversation, the field site is understood in relation to museums or laboratories or archives back home. And in this model, the field site emerges as a site of collection or extraction, and the laboratory or museum back home becomes a site of accumulation. So here's a diagram from Bruno Latour's book, Science in Action, that lays out how this model is supposed to work. So here, he's actually talking about expeditions to the Pacific in the 19th century. And he imagines the metropole, Paris, as a place where expeditions on ships leave, and they go out into the Pacific to gather cartographic knowledge, to figure out what's actually out there. And the first expedition, X1, disappears. We don't know what happens to it. Again, question mark. Expedition 2 goes out, and they arrive at an island north of Japan, what we now call Sakhalin Island. And here, they cross other people's paths, and they'll ask indigenous people, tell us what's around you. Do you live on an island or a peninsula? And they'll gather this intelligence, add this to other mapping intelligence, and they'll return it back to Paris, where that information is recorded and stored. Further expeditions go out from Paris, they cross other people's paths, they eventually return back to Paris. Over time, says Bruno Latour, a kind of informational asymmetry develops, where Paris gets lots of credible, secured knowledge. They know what the world looks like out there in the Pacific. They actually know that Sakhalin Island is an island. They've sailed all the way around it. But the people living there don't. They're stuck with their petty local geographies. They don't even know whether they live on an island or a peninsula. And so he says that a laboratory or a museum or a guild of cartographers, this is a kind of site of accumulation, a place where knowledge piles up. But when I look at this diagram, I sometimes wonder if maybe this question mark shouldn't stand in for a lost expedition, but we can imagine this question mark as the expression of these two people who are walking left to right here. And you can imagine what it's like out there in the field, because from their perspective, expedition after expedition after expedition keeps showing up. And I imagine them thinking like, oh, Jesus, here comes another one of those bloody expeditions again. And so what if we thought about the field site not as a place of extraction or collection, but as a site of accumulation? A place where field workers keep arriving over and over again, and we actually see huge accumulations of knowledges, of encounters, and of experience with fieldwork. I actually take very seriously the idea that in places like Pitcairn and Norfolk Island that are much studied, where lots of expeditions keep arriving, that Pitcairn Islanders actually become in some ways more expert at fieldwork than are the field workers that come to study them, because they have this kind of experience. So the argument of my book essentially derives from this idea that we should think of Pitcairn and Norfolk Island as sites of accumulation. And if we do this and we tackle the question of how a natural laboratory is made, then we realize that natural laboratories aren't natural at all, that they're made through accumulations of knowledge and experience, not only in metropoles like Paris, but through local accumulations in the field. Moreover, Pitcairn and Norfolk Islands become natural laboratories not only through the work of scientists, but through a much longer history of iterative encounter between investigators and investigated. That history includes, crucially, not just scientists, but sailors, missionaries, agents of the colonial state. There's a long history of encounter that underwrites this notion. And finally, I want to suggest that the language of the natural laboratory, or the natural experiment, in fact deliberately works to obscure this history of entanglement and encounter. It actually obscures the history that turns these places into natural laboratories in the first place. All right, so why did Pitcairn and Norfolk especially become famous natural laboratories? And it's because they are attached to another very famous story in English literature and history. I always ask this question just because I take a kind of running informal survey and I'm just really curious. Who here has heard of the mutiny on the Bounty? Oh, that's interesting. And it's actually laying out some demographic trends, so I hope you don't mind my noticing that. But often audiences that are a bit older have heard of this because they've seen one of these movies with Clark Gable or Marlon Brando or Mel Gibson. And young people just haven't, because this last movie came out before I was born. In Australia, a lot of people have heard of it, but in England and the States, not so much. But this is a thing people know from movies, but it's actually based on a real event. So in 1789, there is a mutiny aboard a Royal Naval vessel off of Tahiti. Master's Mate Fletcher Christian sets Lieutenant William Bligh adrift on a boat, and he and his mutineers abscond with the ship back to Tahiti. They kidnap 12 Tahitian women and 6 Tahitian men, and they set sail into the eastern Pacific until they eventually land at Pitcairn Island, which is right here. If you turn the globe so the Pacific faces you, it's pretty much smack dab in the center. It's very far away from many other inhabited places. And they regard this as a place where they can hide out from the Royal Navy, should the Royal Navy come looking for them and try to hang them. After a long history in which most of the men murder each other, there are some survivors, and by 1808, there is a small colony of descendants of Britons and Tahitians living on Pitcairn Island. Now, my book really starts in 1808, because my book is a history of encounters and investigations into Pitcairn Island. And one of the stories that first emerges in the encounter with Pitcairn Island looks like this. This is an often reprinted story, often told as second or third or fourth hand. But the first people to encounter Pitcairn Island were American whalers from New Bedford. And these American whalers are almost always described as having this conversation with the Pitcairn Islanders. They arrive at what seems like an uninhabited island, and a canoe launches from the island to meet their boat. It looks like a canoe that one would find anywhere else in eastern Polynesia, but they are greeted by that canoe. So the Americans ask them, "Who are you?" And the canoers respond in English and say, "We are English." The Americans ask, "Where are you born?" And they say, "On that island, which you see." The Americans are confused. They say, well, how are you Englishmen if you were born on that island, which the English have never possessed? And they say, we are English because our father was an Englishman. And they say, who's your father? And they say, well, Alec. Do you know Alec? Of course we don't know Alec. They say, well, do you know Captain Bligh of the Bounty? And this is always treated as a moment of shock and revelation and wonder, because now the sailors and the readers can slot this into a canonical story. Already by 1808, the mutiny on the Bounty is legendary in the Anglophone. Now, this conversation is really interesting to me because I think it's already setting some of the parameters for investigation into affairs on Norfolk Island. Already, people are trying to sort out how they're going to navigate hybridity. Are these people Polynesian? Are they English? And by what criteria are we going to decide whether they are Polynesian or English or something else? So that gets published widely, but a bunch of stuff gets published widely in the early Victorian, well, the Regency through the early Victorian periods. Here's just a sampling of these. We get poems by Lord Byron, Mary Russell Mitford, lots of really famous British writers. And Pitcairn Island also appears really often in religious tracts. So in early encounters with Pitcairn Island, the islanders go to great lengths to perform their Anglicanism for any sailors that arrive. The story always goes that last surviving mutineer, John Adams, taught the islanders to read and write English from the Book of Common Prayer and from the Anglican Bible. Now, I think that this is meant to be a kind of performance of Englishness that's meant to answer some of this question around hybridity. How do you sort out whether you are Polynesian or English? They do so by performing whiteness as religiosity. So they can assert that they are in fact British, they are in fact white because they are Anglican and because they can perform a kind of nationalistic Protestantism in these registers. Eventually, that literature becomes really widespread and this becomes a trope about the Pitcairn Islanders. The idea is that John Adams and the first generation of Pitcairn Island has somehow, out of mutiny and treason, managed to create a very pure Protestant utopia on this island. The language usually used is that they have somehow refounded Eden. And so we'll get accounts like this one, which is from the diary of a Royal Navy lieutenant who was approaching Pitcairn Island in 1852. And he writes, having read so much about the mutiny of the Bounty and the subsequent romantic history of the mutineers, I experienced a feeling of something I know not what to call it on approaching the island, that I have felt when visiting some spot held sacred, either from history or from being the scene of some biblical relation. It's a secret kind of satisfaction. So here, the religiosity, the notion that these places are religiously pure, has made Pitcairn Island exceptional. It's being thought of as in some way outside of history. Now, this is also work that's meant to regard them as pure in some ways, but that pureness is in deliberate tension with the islanders' supposed hybridity. So it's really interesting to me that they constantly use the language of pureness and purity and exceptionalism in order to describe a population that really presents problems for the British in the way they imagine the world, that this is a place that's locked between Tahitianness and Polynesianness. And I want to suggest that this, too, lays out the template for later visits. The island is already marked out as exceptional, and it's already marked out as a place where we have to address questions of hybridity and where certain notions of purity and maybe descent are going to help sort those questions out. All right, so how do these islands then go from becoming pure and exceptional to becoming experimentalized? And the answer lies in British colonialism, as it always does for me. I'm a British colonial historian. So in the 1850s, the islanders have accrued quite a lot of sympathy in London. There's a Pitcairn Island Fund Committee, which is devoted to overseeing the welfare of the islanders, and they raise money and eventually send some ships with supplies. But by 1855-56, they grow concerned that the island is going to run out of food and fresh water, that it might hit its carrying capacity. And so they start scouting out for another home for the Pitcairn Islanders, and they find one in Norfolk Island. Now, Norfolk Island had been a notorious penal colony in the British Empire. This was the era of transportation. In Britain, you would talk about the Department of Transport. You never talk about the Department of Transportation, because transportation is your forced exile as a criminal punishment. So if you are transported in 19th century Britain, you might have stolen a loaf of bread in London, and then you would be sent to New South Wales in Australia. If you offended, again, in New South Wales, you might be sent to Van Diemen's Land, what's today Tasmania. And if you offended there, you would be sent to a small island about 500 miles from anything else called Norfolk Island. So it's meant to be the worst of the worst, the kind of hell in the Pacific. By the 1850s, the British stopped their policy of transportation. This is an era of reform, and they decided this is too inhumane. So they shut the prison colony down. And the Pitcairn Island Fund Committee thinks, what a perfect site for the Pitcairn Islanders. They've already refounded Eden, so maybe they can turn hell into paradise again. They can refound Eden on this place. The governor of Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, who's also in charge of Norfolk Island, decides this is a fantastic idea. Alongside the bishops of Oxford and London, he lobbies for this, and the Colonial Office and Crown assent. They hand over Norfolk Island to the Pitcairn Islanders. And he decides that if we're going to move them here, we should set some parameters. We're actually going to ban any emigration by other people to Norfolk Island. We want to deliberately maintain their exclusion. So he writes in a letter, it would be, in my opinion, advisable at all events present to prohibit all grants of land to others than the race now about to inhabit this small island, and to hold out as little encouragement as possible to the domestication of other races, be they white or colored among them, until the effect of their removal and of the altered circumstances in which they're about to be placed can be clearly seen. And he deliberately calls this an experiment. This is the first time in the archive that I found that anyone calls Pitcairn or Norfolk Island an experiment. And here it's an experiment that's meant to hash out certain things. Can this culturally and racially hybrid people replicate its success? Can they be a vision of successful colonization? And this is a question with really high stakes in the British Empire of this period. This is a moment when the settler empire in places like New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Canada is expanding at a massive clip. And the question is, what will the racial and civilizational makeup of these places look like? Is a form of racial or cultural hybridity potentially successful? Can they manage the land? Can they produce a productive colony on their own? So Denison sends a ship to Pitcairn Island in 1856. The islanders are not given a choice. They are forcibly migrated from Pitcairn Island to Norfolk Island in that year. Some of the islanders arrive in Norfolk, decide that they are very unhappy with this because they're essentially moving into a prison. They're handed cows and told that they're now going to be pastoralists, even though they've never seen one before. And so some of them actually move back to Pitcairn Island 3 years later. So today we have descendant populations of the bounty mutineers on both islands. But I'm going to keep looking at Norfolk Island for a little bit. So on Norfolk Island, colonial administrators work over the next half century to continually investigate this site, both just as administrators, but also in order to assess the outcome of this experiment. And over the intervening decades, their assessments turn towards the pessimistic. This is inflected by the eugenic discourse at the time, and they increasingly decide that the islanders are becoming deteriorated or devolved or degenerate. So I'm going to look at one report from 1903 that is an especially good archive of this kind of investigative work. And I want to look at it to see exactly how the British state goes about assessing an experiment and to see precisely how on the ground an experiment is actually conducted in this way. So in 1903, Australia has recently federated. It's now become a semi-independent dominion in the British Empire. And the governor of New South Wales sends a land commissioner to Norfolk Island to see how well the islanders are using their land, to see if they're using this land productively. That figure is a Mr. Houston. So Houston arrives on Norfolk Island, and he immediately starts asking questions about the moral affairs of the island. And he also takes with him a secretary who records every interview that he has with a Norfolk Islander in shorthand. He anonymizes these transcripts and has them typed up. So for me as a historian, this is an amazing archive because I have nearly every encounter that he's preserved on this island listed, he says, verbatim. And we get conversations like this one where Mr. Houston talks to anonymous Mr. Six. Mr. Houston says, well, you say the moral condition of the island is what? And Mr. Six says, it's really bad. And he asks, well, how do you get direct evidence of this? How would I assess the moral condition of the island? And he refers to lots of sort of underground stories of essentially sexual promiscuity, and especially births outside of wedlock. And this becomes the dominant arbiter that the British use to determine the moral state of this colony, and also lots of other colonies. So to assess the larger moral topography of the island, Houston, a couple of days later, does what he was supposed to do. He's a land commissioner. He's supposed to look at land use. And he sits in the island meeting house with a map of every residence on the island. And he goes through these residences with a leader of the island council and with the local constable. And house by house, he asks not only what is the state of repair for the house, but what is the moral state of the family living in it? How many births outside of wedlock? What kind of sexual licentiousness is going on? And so here we get them pausing before house number 13, and the constable says, "Oh, George is all right, sir. And he's got 2 daughters, one with illegitimate children, or one has one illegitimate child, the other one has 2. And we learn that the family has been very loose in this way. And he goes like this, house by house, until he's assembled a moral topography of the entire island. Now, on the basis of this report and lots of other reports, the Colonial Office and its governors essentially decide that this experiment has failed. And they deliberately put an end to the policy of exclusion of immigration from elsewhere by 1910. Writing in that year, the governor of New South Wales says, "The attempt was made in 1856 to establish on an inaccessible island a community free from all the evils of civilization, and to reproduce in the 19th century a Garden of Eden without the serpent. I do not hesitate to say that no experiment has ever failed so dismally, and that Norfolk Islanders of today, so far from being innocent and virtuous, are as debased, as idle, as immoral a people as exists on the face of the earth." So, yeah, it's pretty harsh words. Following this, the Australian government essentially diminishes the island's capacity for self-rule. They allow other people to settle on the island, and they make it a deliberate policy to scrub out through education the Creole language that the islanders speak. So this is something with real stakes. All right, so with the rest of my time, I want to ask how we go from an island that's experimentalized by the government to an island that's experimentalized by science. So the move from Pitcairn to Norfolk is incredibly heavily publicized. Already, this is an island that most English-speaking people, at least in Britain and Australia and New Zealand, would have already heard of. And the move generates a lot of interest. So Alfred Russel Wallace, which he's a figure you might have heard of. He co-invented the theory of evolution by means of natural selection alongside Charles Darwin, is really upset by this. He thinks that Pitcairn was a place where the natural experiment was already running, and he encourages the British government to maintain isolation. And speaking of Darwin, he also uses the Pitcairn Islanders a couple of times. They show up in The Descent of Man, and here he's really interested in working out a biological question. So a running concern for anthropologists in the 19th and into the early 20th century is what happens when 2 quote-unquote races interbreed? What will happen to that population? Will these be negative effects? Will there be positive effects? And Darwin vouches for what he calls hybrid vigor. He suggests that when you have 2 strains that are previously far apart, then you'll get a large mixture of variables and you'll end up with a much stronger population. And he uses the Pitcairn Islanders on Norfolk Island in order to make this case. He says that they've actually procreated at a really high rate, Darwinian fitness. And so it's a pretty successful experiment. But by the 19th century, or by the early 20th century, physical anthropology becomes especially concerned with measuring sort of racial fitness at the corporeal level. And so science is desperate to get their hands on some bodies of Pitcairn Islanders. A couple filter their way into London once in a while. So there's this man, Charles Young. He and his brother were collected, essentially, by an archaeologist in 1917 and were brought to one of Britain's premier anthropologists who took out calipers and measured his head and also looked at him in relation to existing Tahitian skeletal specimens. And he determined that these were very unfit people, that they were essentially both morally and intellectually unhealthy, inferior to Britons in many capacities. But this was just 2 people. What anthropology really wanted was to do field work at the site. But through this kind of steady investigation, through their steady reference, they show up in Wallace, Darwin, Westermarck, lots of people, Arthur Keith, they begin appearing in textbooks by the 1910s and the 1920s. And it's in a textbook that one of the first physical anthropologists in the United States first encounters the Pitcairn Islanders. That's Harry Shapiro, who's doing an anthropology PhD at Harvard under Ernst Huden. And Shapiro, doing the first PhD in physical anthropology in the United States, decides that the best case he could look at would be the Pitcairn Islanders, because here he could study what precisely constitutes race at a bodily level. But he also decides that this case would make a lot of sense because on Pitcairn Island, you could also trace race genetically. The early 20th century is a period when Mendelian genetics is coming to prominence, and the question for anthropology becomes how precisely, if race is a thing, will race be inherited from generation to generation? Pitcairn Island makes a ton of sense to look at to answer this question to a 19th century race scientist, because here you know the pedigrees, you know the genealogies, you know who begat whom, going all the way back to the bounty. So Shapiro sets out for Pitcairn Island in 1924. He doesn't make it because it's really hard to get to Pitcairn Island. It's very far away from just about anything. He's on a container ship coming out of the Panama Canal bound for Wellington, but there's a storm, so he just can't disembark. But he still has to do his dissertation research. So he goes to Norfolk Island instead. On Norfolk Island, he's able to take anthropometric photos and to take measurements of people, but no one is willing to talk to him about genealogies. Imagine why. We've just heard about the half-century of investigation that the British have been doing on this island, which is deeply invested in questions of whose biological parents are whose, and they're reluctant to share that kind of data. Now, Shapiro does finally get a chance to go to Pitcairn Island in 1934 as part of an American Museum of Natural History expedition. He becomes curator of anthropology there. And on Pitcairn Island, he thinks, well, now I might actually have a chance to do this kind of genetic work. I can take measurements of these islanders, but I can also get a hold of genealogies. And in his field notes, he imagines this as a kind of natural laboratory. But once he arrives, he realizes how unlaboratory-like a place that is. While addressing the entire population of the island in the meeting house on his second night there, he writes in his diary, suddenly and unbidden, the thought came to me that the success of my work depended on the cooperation of these people, and that they might not understand or might even be hostile to me, however scientific in aim my intentions are. He longs for the godlike power of an entomologist or a zoologist who doesn't need to placate his subjects. So he begins doing work on Pitcairn Island, and he takes lots of measurements, he takes lots of photographs, but he has trouble getting genealogies. Finally, he does speak with some informants who he claims are happy to give him the true biological parentage, essentially to spill secrets. So here's an example of one of these from his field notes, where he talks with an octogenarian, Mary Ann McCoy, who is shamefully confessing all of the secret fraternities on the island. Now, of course, she's known Shapiro for 3 days, so I'm not sure how secret this knowledge actually is. But what's interesting to me is that Shapiro decides that on an island that's actually this complicated, this entangled in a long history of investigation, that it might just not be possible to know. He becomes incredibly anxious about the possibility of ever accruing real knowledge about kinship or biological paternity on a place like this. And so in his field notes, he essentially gives up. He says, I'm probably never going to get what I can deem accurate knowledge of these things. So then once he gets back to New York and he starts going through his results, he gives up on doing Mendelian genetics. He says this is just fundamentally not possible. And he reverts back to assessing all of his data by using typological racial science. He basically arrays most of his measurements on an entirely subjective scale, running from strongly English to strongly Tahitian. On most of his anthropometric notes, where he's carefully taking, I think, 37 different measurements of each body, in the bottom left corner, he just writes T++, or T+, or E++, to rate whether he thinks they're English or Tahitian. And this becomes the final quantitative arbiter by which he runs through his data. But then he publishes this monograph in 36, and it becomes the anthropological monograph on Pitcairn Island. Here you can see that the title itself is putting a privilege on heritage. This is why you'd want to study this place. And in all of the publications, in that publication itself, and the sort of celebratory New York Times articles that come around it, he reverts back to the language of natural laboratory. He says, little did the 9 mutineers of the HMS Bounty who landed know that their descendants would become human guinea pigs for the study of heredity. And so here he's kind of scrubbing out the history, the long history of entanglement, the very complicated on-the-ground accumulations of experiments that he had in order to construe it as laboratory-like. All right, and this is an idea that really persists in the history of science. So Norfolk Island and Pitcairn Island alike are widely construed as natural laboratories for the study of language. Both islands speak a kind of Creole language, though what you call it depends on which linguist you ask. It can be a cant, a trading jargon, a pidgin language, a Creole, depending on who you talk to. If you talk to the Norfolk Islanders, it's a language. And here, I actually interviewed a linguist who works on Norfolk Island today, and he told me that all of his colleagues in biology should be deeply jealous of him because he has a laboratory where he can watch evolution happen in real time. The language of a laboratory is alive and well in both of these places. But I would also argue, and I do in my book, that if you look at the data that the linguists themselves are using in publishing, you can see a long history of entanglements like this. So here's a section from a transcript from a 1964 treatise on the Pitcairnese language, where a Pitcairn informant is talking to a linguistic researcher. And here the informant says, oh, now we're imagining watching some children playing, but now that the children know we're watching them, the children are behaving better. They certainly are, they're feeling ashamed. And the linguist asks, they're ashamed, are they? And the informant says, yes, because a non-Pitcairner is watching them. So there are lots of obvious ways in which the history, this very complicated history of entanglement gets encoded in the archive of science. This is also something that's alive and well today, not just in linguistics, but in genetics. So over the last 20 years, there have been a series of genetic studies on Norfolk Island, where researchers from Australia and the United States have been doing linkage analyses in the genomes of Pitcairn Islanders, looking for things like ocular degeneration, heart disease, to see if these might map out onto the genome in some way. But once they had the samples, they thought, well, let's answer the old question. Let's just hash out how English or how Polynesian these places are. And they're doing admixture studies that, to my mind, really harken back to some of the work that people like Shapiro were doing. Now, these islands are also really complicated. You might have remembered this from 15 years ago. If you're Australian or New Zealander, you definitely would have. That in 2004, it was discovered that there was a long-standing culture of sexual assault on Pitcairn Island, and that most of the island's adult male population had been systematically assaulting and abusing the women and girls on the island going back at least 50 years, though I can tell you from the archives that have discovered this goes back a bit further. Now, I study the resulting criminal trial because I find it deeply interesting. So the British government had to decide, what jurisdiction is Pitcairn Island actually under? Are they legally British or not? This is an island that's founded by mutineers. They got a constitution from a ship's captain who stops by one afternoon. So it's a sticky problem. And in this court case, both the defense and the prosecution went back to the long history of investigation into this island to sort out this question. Are they English? Are they Tahitian? The Pitcairn Islanders themselves launched what some journalists called the Margaret Mead defense. They said, essentially, who are your Westerners with your Western mores to tell us what our sort of sexual culture should be on Pitcairn Island? That's not something that held up in court, but they used the long history of investigation into Pitcairn Island to try out this argument. That trial got written about a lot, including by this best-selling journalist. And Kathy Marks, in a book on the trial, writes, what does Pitcairn Island tell us about human nature? Is Pitcairn Island a cautionary tale? And it's pretty dark, but she suggests, in some ways, the same thing that lots of people have always suggested about this place, that it's a utopia or it's a dystopia, but either way, it's a Foucauldian heterotopia. This is a small place that in some way mirrors the larger world, and this is a place that we can use to hash out really big questions about human nature. But as persistent as the idea is, one of the reasons I want to write this book is because I want to show how historically constructed that idea is on a place like Norfolk Island. So I want to close by showing you this. This is a picture I took on Norfolk Island in 2014, and this is a copy of that linguistic treatise from 1964. But this is a copy of that treatise that a journalist on the island pulled out of a house fire. His house was set on fire, he claims, in a deliberate act of arson because he was on the wrong side of a political question. He was for greater Australian intervention on Norfolk Island, and he wasn't thought of as being sufficiently in the Pitcairn Islander camp. And so here you have, in some ways, a very poignant illustration of the ways that research continues to accumulate on this island. Stuff that people write in the outside world comes back to places like Pitcairn and Norfolk. When I was on both islands, people said, oh, you're here to study the research? I'll show you this published book about the island. But also that this is a testament to the other kinds of accumulations on this island, the other kinds of entanglements that a long history of encounter with the colonial state and with other kinds of investigators has produced. All right, so I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.